back to History Class with Dr. W and our study of 1968. We've been talking about the popular culture of 1968, some of the books and movies that transformed that year. In the previous lecture, we looked at a number of the biggest box office films released in 1968. In this part of the lecture, we'll look at a few more movies released in 1968 that touched on some of the important social and cultural issues of the day. One film of the year that had a lasting impact and stirred a lot of controversy was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a film starring Sidney Poitier, Katharine Hepburn, Catherine Houghton, and Spencer Tracy, which addressed the controversial issue of interracial relationships. This was the last film for Spencer Tracy, who died just before shooting was completed, and one of a number of breakthrough performances for Sidney Poitier, who was becoming one of America's foremost African-American actors. In the film, Poitier played a respectable black doctor who was coming to San Francisco to meet his soon-to-be in-laws of a white woman played by Catherine Houghton. This was not just a comedy about a white woman bringing a black man home, although the title suggests comedic elements. The makers of the film did a superb job of conveying that Poitier's character was unimpeachable, which made any kind of stereotypical racist thoughts about his character seem foolish as you watch the film. One critic of the film described it this way: "Suddenly, everybody's caught up in a kind of integrated drawing room comedy and unable to decide whether there's anything funny in it or not." So, yes, while there are many humorous elements of the film, it touched on a very important topic in the country, and particularly so in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination and so many of the other racial issues swirling that I've described in previous lectures. In the end, the film conveyed a very wholesome message that the races can get along in this country, and that in fact many of the kind of racial stereotypes that we engage in are sort of laughable in the grander scheme of human existence and cooperation. A less well-remembered film of the year is Psych Out, which starred a young Jack Nicholson as a strung-out hippie named Stoney. In the film, he meets Jenny, who's played by Susan Strasberg, who is a deaf runaway arriving in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district and ultimately getting caught up in the hippie lifestyle. The plot of the film takes many twists and turns, but on the whole, it's a condemnation of the hippie and drug culture that was so popular at that time, as many of the characters wind up getting into trouble of one sort or another, or even dying in the midst of action that often is taking place as the characters are tripping on LSD or other psychedelic drugs. There are points in the film where it's unclear whether the action is real or some kind of drug-induced mirage. In the end, it's clear that the filmmaker's message is that nothing good comes out of this kind of drug lifestyle. Another memorable film of the year, if not a critical success, is the campy sci-fi film Barbarella, starring Jane Fonda. The plot of the film is simply ludicrous, as the prudish Jane Fonda character sets about to save the world by undergoing an array of sexual situations that her character was completely naive about. While the film was essentially a critical and box office bomb at the time, and it was panned by the critics, it has become something of a cult favorite with a certain following, and it was influential on other films that followed in its wake, films like Austin Powers, which were much more successful later on. One of the bigger films of the year, although it's less remembered now, was Funny Girl, which starred Barbara Streisand, playing in the role of the comedian Fanny Brice, and based on the stage musical of the same name. It was directed by William Wyler and co-starred Omar Sharif in the role of Nick Arnstein. The film was both a commercial and critical success, with Streisand winning the Academy Award for Best Actress, and it was also the top grossing film of the year. The film pointed to the influence of Broadway and musicals in films of the late 1960s, as a number of other popular movies in 1968 were either adaptations of Broadway musicals or themselves involved a great deal of music. In that vein, a few other movies warrant mention here, and they achieved some degree of a following in 1968, even if they're not well regarded or well remembered now. One of them was Yellow Submarine, an animated feature film which involved cartoon figures of the Beatles and, of course, a soundtrack involving many of their songs, and the title song, Yellow Submarine, which became a huge hit for the Beatles. And we'll be talking about the music of 1968 in a future lecture. Another example is Oliver, which was another of the biggest movies of the year. It actually won the Academy Award for Best Picture and a number of other awards in that year, and of course was based on the stage musical Oliver. Another example of the relationship between Broadway and Hollywood was The Producers, which was a film written and directed by Mel Brooks about the efforts to actually produce a Broadway flop. And this movie actually won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay by Mel Brooks, and went on later to spawn a very successful Broadway show in the 21st century, and other sequels in terms of films. As a final example, I want to mention one last film, Paper Lion, which is akin to the creative nonfiction genre, in the sense that it involved a reporter named George Plimpton undergoing the personal experience of trying out for the Detroit Lions. The result, as you might expect, is a hilarity of catastrophes for a slender, run-of-the-mill reporter trying to make an NFL team. But it was a critical success. The movie was well received as well, and like some of these other films that we've talked about, it actually spawned a host of imitators in the future. This whole idea of a regular Joe experiencing something or undergoing something continues to be a very popular kind of storyline right up to this day. There were, of course, many other films released in 1968, and I invite and encourage listeners and viewers to go back and check out some of those films on your own. But this is a dozen or so of the movies that made the biggest impact in terms of winning awards, some of the biggest box office productions. But just note that in their own way, they all reflect the social and cultural issues that were going on in the country. There are many of them that involve issues related to the Cold War, nuclear weapons, fears of atomic war, and so on. In our final lectures of the course, we will turn to perhaps the most lasting legacy of 1968, and again, one that reflects very much the culture and society of the time, the music of the year.